Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 32 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Expedition. Sometimes the fates align in such a way as to mess up your whole world. While my scientific query about the jar's contents were answered, the resulting cleanup operations engaged me for the balance of the weekend. After picking up the broken glass and getting rid of the slow-moving bugs, I had to dig up the garage floor where the jars broke and replace that dirt with dirt from outside. It was late in the evening Sunday when I finally had the garage floor raked smooth to Dad's liking. I was still in trouble when the weekend before Halloween rolled around, so I did not get to go fishing that Saturday. Apparently, it was a banner day because Dad came home with 3 large salmon this time, and I was relegated to cleaning them. Not only that, but I had to make sure and separate the salmon eggs and put them in jars for future trout bait. Then, I was not allowed to disappear, but spent the whole afternoon and evening in the kitchen with Dad making pickled salmon. The pickled salmon was good, and I had to say I liked it better than the pickled herring, but I really preferred smoked salmon. Good thing, too, 'cause I got to spend Sunday tending the fire in the smokehouse, cleaning up drippings and making sure it did not get too hot or cold while Dad smoked salmon. His preferred method of smoking salmon was to crack a beer, drink half of it, arrange salmon fillets on a rack, and hand me the rack to hang in the smokehouse while he finished his beer. When I returned with the next rack, the process would be repeated after he quizzed me on the temperature of the smokehouse and how much wood I added to the fire. I was pretty happy when the last of the smoked salmon had been packaged and put away. Adding to these chores was the fact that it had been snowing on and off all week. I loved the snow, and being restricted to the house and chores kept me from exploring in the woods and playing in the snow. I did manage to return from the smokehouse the long way a couple times, so my path took me under the Bartlett pear tree. The pears were ripe, and I managed to eat about half a dozen very soft and sweet pears. The best ones were already lying on the ground. The talk at school Monday centered on Halloween, and I was mildly hopeful that I would be able to participate. It seemed to me that I had been sufficiently punished for peeing in jars and storing them in the attic. But it was not to be. I watched from my window when Mom pulled her car out of the driveway shortly after we got home from school. She was taking Mark to the trailer court where we used to live so he could go trick-or-treating with Sarah and another friend there. I had some leftovers for dinner and was asleep before anyone got home that night. Temperatures seemed to steadily decline through the month of November, as did the memory of my transgressions. We did have some sunny days with almost warm afternoons, and on one of these occasions, Mark and I managed to hoist the wooden wire spool up into Fort Stix. It made a grand table, and we arranged plastic milk crates around it for chairs. I found my interest in box traps once again and worked on them in the evenings after school when it was not too cold. Progress was slow until the week of Thanksgiving when we were off school. I managed to complete 2 of them early in the week, but the weather turned colder as dark gray clouds moved in. I might have completed more, but I spent quite a bit of time in the woods tracking animals and deciding where I would set traps. I slept in on the day before Thanksgiving, reluctant to climb out of my nice warm blankets. When I did finally have to get out of the bed from the need to use the restroom, I was glad to see that Mom had the space heater running in the bathroom. I knew she was not planning on bathing, but rather, she was not fond of the cold toilet seat. When I finished, I added some coal to the fire to keep it going and went off to get my breakfast. I sat at the desk near the stove to eat. When Dad finally got up at the crack of noon, he wasted no time in drinking a pot of coffee and herding me out to the garage so we could invite the guest of honor to Thanksgiving dinner. garage was cold when I entered, and all of the birds were inside the enclosure we made for them. The bulbs were doing a good job, though, since it was much warmer inside the bird pens when I entered with their food and water. I think the turkey knew what was up, and he would not cooperate in leaving the pen. Dad stood near the door as I walked behind the turkey to herd him into the garage, but each time he felt the cold air, he turned and went back the way he came. I could not just grab him since he was a fully matured turkey with claws and big spurs. He would shred me if I got rough with him. I let him be for a while as I considered what to do. Getting a piece of small rope, I made a loop on the end and then a lasso. I laid it on the ground and sprinkled some crushed corn in it and waited. The chickens came and checked out the corn, but they moved off since they were more interested in the millet. Finally, the turkey sauntered over to check out the corn. He cocked his head sideways and looked at me with one eye suspiciously. I turned to look the other way while keeping the loop of rope in the corner of my eye. He began to eat the corn, and I let him get most of it before picking up the rope and closing the loop around his neck. To my surprise, he did not jump around flapping his wings in an effort to escape. He looked up at me and then went back to eating the corn. I figured it was his last meal, so I let him finish and let him out of the pen. Dad took over then, taking the rope and leading him to the stump. In one quick motion, he hooked the rope on a nail there, pulled so the turkey stretched his neck across the stump, and it was done. I had not noticed the pot of boiling water on the burner until then, and was actually happy to pluck the warm bird as the hot water warmed my hands. Thanksgiving morning saw fewer dark clouds, but still no real sunshine. Mom and Dad started cooking the turkey before they went to bed the night before, and the house already smelled of roasted bird. They were up drinking coffee when I went in to get breakfast. I was surprised they sounded happy and not arguing as usual, so when they asked me to cut vegetables for the finger food tray, I got to it. Mom even got out a big white tablecloth and placemats to make up the dining table for dinner. By the time lunch rolled around, most everything was ready, and the bird was in the browning stage. The sun was shining in the early afternoon when Aunt Janita and Sarah arrived. Since Uncle Jim was on a run in California, they decided to have Thanksgiving dinner with us. I was glad, since it would give me someone closer to my age to talk to, and we ran off to Fort Stix to hang out and smoke where the adults would not see. Sarah was suitably impressed by my new fort, although she said it needed a woman's touch to make it more homely. Things like curtains on the viewports and rugs on the floor. I reminded her that this was not a treehouse, but rather a fort. What it needed was more whiskey bottles and weapons, like crossbows and rock launchers. We laughed about this, and then Sarah got very serious for a moment. "Kevin," she began, "from now on, I do not want to be called Sarah." I looked at her and could see she was serious. "But that is your name," I said. "Yes, but I do not like it," she said. "I want to be called by my middle name from now on. I want everyone to call me D." I looked at her for a moment, cocking my head to the side. D? Somehow that just did not ring true to me. "But you do not look like a D," I said. "You look like Sarah, the happy girl, who cooks and keeps house and knows how to do stuff other girls do not know how to do." She seemed to get upset at this. "That is why I do not want to be called Sarah," she said emphatically. "I do not want people to think of me as someone who is a perfect little housewife. I want to be wild and free." "But," I started, but she cut me off. "Ever since I baked a bunch of cupcakes and took them to school for my class, the girls all call me Sarah Lee," she looked at me. "You know, like snack cakes. I hate it." "But Sarah," I started and then caught myself. "D, you've always been Sarah to me ever since we met a few years ago." "Not anymore," she said and leaned over to hug me. You know everyone does what you do when you come to the trailer park. They all look up to you. So if you do this for me, then everyone else will too. Okay, I said, seeing her smile as I hugged her back. But when we are alone like this, you're still Sarah to me. I could see she was not totally happy with that, but decided it would be enough. I was just about to say something else when she shushed me. You hear that? She asked. I listened and could hear crunching in the snow below the fort. Dee quickly crushed out her cigarette and hid them in her coat pocket. Then we heard Mark's voice. It's just Mark, I said. He comes out here too. The sound of someone climbing up the ladder resonated through the fort, and then the hatch in the floor opened. I was just taking a drag off my cigarette when Aunt Janita popped her head up and looked around. I quickly moved the cigarette behind my back. Aunt Janita, I sputtered. What are you doing out here in the woods? She looked at me curiously for a moment and then gave me a knowing wink. I knew she had seen the cigarette, or at least smelled the smoke in the fort, since the windows were closed to keep the cold out. Hi, baby, she said. Come on, you guys. It's cold out here, and it's time to eat. Okay, let me close up the fort and we will be right there, I said, and turned to go close the porch door. Looking out the window, I saw Mark was with her as she headed back to the house. I had not even thought to lock the hatch when Dee and I came out. Next time, I would for sure. Now I had to worry if she was going to tell my dad I was smoking. I did not think so, but you never know. We went back in the house through the front door so we could leave our boots and coats in the salon side of my room. We could hear everyone in the dining room, and I saw my mom and Aunt Janita crossing back and forth from the kitchen to the dining room. We wasted no time in getting to where the food was. To my surprise, Aunt Florence was seated between my dad and Aunt Janita with Mom to his right, and Grandpa was seated at the other end of the table. This left Mark sitting between Grandpa and Aunt Janita, and Dee and I on the opposite side of the table. I made sure to sit next to Grandpa so I could talk to him at dinner. Where's Grandma? I asked Grandpa. Oh, she had a bit of a sniffle and did not want to go out in the cold, so she would not get sick, Grandpa said. She said for you boys to come see her tomorrow and she would give you pie. Oh, okay, I said. Grandma was always worried about getting sick, except for bingo night at the church. On bingo night, she would go out of the house in the cold with wet hair if she had to. Grandpa stood up and said grace once everyone was seated, and then Dad stood up and reached for a plate on the table. He took a couple things off and handed it to Mom, who passed it on around. I pickled some salmon, and Kevin smoked a bunch of salmon, Dad said. I would like if everyone tried a little taste and let us know what you think. I was surprised he said I smoked the salmon, and wondered if he did so because he felt bad that I was not allowed to go on the last salmon fishing trip of the year. The weather had kept us off the water, and now the run was over until next year. The plate made the rounds of the table, and Aunt Janita was the first to speak up. She said the pickled salmon tasted good, but was a bit mushy. The smoked salmon, though, was a hit with everyone, and I wondered if we would ever get to the turkey because they all asked for more smoked salmon. Finally, Dad carved the turkey, and our Thanksgiving dinner commenced. As expected, the adults drank wine with the meal, giving us each a little. They took turns telling stories of previous holidays and such, which kept us all entertained. I ate way too much and was soon relaxing on my couch listening to the radio. Dee came in and joined me, sitting on the chair in the corner. We'd only been relaxing for about a half an hour when it started to get dark, despite it being too early for sundown. I looked out the window to see dark clouds gathered, and it was snowing hard. The snow was really coming down, and in the few minutes I watched, it piled up at least an inch. Aunt Janita came in and told Dee to get her stuff together because they had to head home before they got snowed in. It was really coming down out there, and despite my father and mother insisting they could stay the night with us, Aunt Janita said she wanted to be home when Uncle Jim called. They walked her out and watched as she drove off. By the time I got back to my couch, her tire tracks in the driveway were filled in as if they were never there. This was going to be a good one. I soon fell asleep, and when I woke in the morning, the first thing I did was look outside. There was over a foot of snow on the ground. It was also cold in the house, and I went to check on the potbelly stove. It still had a fire, but it was very low and not putting off much heat. In fact, the space heater in the bathroom was putting off more heat than the stove. I tossed in a couple pieces of wood and put some coal on top of that. It was not long before the fire was burning good, and I knew the coal would catch and burn slow. By the time I got out of the bathroom, the center of the house was warm again. The heat had not yet reached the kitchen nor my front room, but I was okay with eating my cereal at the desk. Mark was not in his room when I looked before breakfast, and I figured he was in Mom's room. She had set up a spare mattress in the corner across from her bed because he sometimes wandered in during the night. I was ready to get out and play in the snow. I had missed out on the last 2 snowfalls when I was in trouble and had time to make up for. I put on a long-sleeve shirt with another shirt over that, and then buttoned my heavy flannel shirt over those. Long socks that came almost to my knees, followed by long underwear, and the thickest pair of jeans I had came next. Finally, I sat by the back door and put on snow boots and a heavy jacket. I was ready. The sun was already up, but I could not see it because of the cloud cover. It was only lightly snowing now, and I was not sure if that was not just snow blowing off of the roof. The thermometer on the back porch said it was 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and when I took my first breath, I knew it was right. That air was frosty and made the inside of my nose feel dry as if it was frozen. I fed the chickens and ducks, but had to carry water out in a pitcher from the kitchen because the faucet on the garage was frozen. They were happy, as usual, so I went off to explore the snow. The frosty blanket of pure white snow covered everything, making the world seem peaceful and serene. There is nothing like the quiet you can immerse yourself into when you are in the woods with a fresh blanket of snow. I love the silence of a fresh snowfall, but even more, I like to use the snow to follow animals to see where they went and what they did. I followed a rabbit's tracks out from under the old truck parked beside the garage, where he had no doubt sat for hours watching it snow. I knew this because I found no incoming tracks. They led away from the truck, circled around the chicken coop, obviously looking for a stray piece of crushed corn from when the chickens were fed, and then meandered off toward the pear tree. I never understood why rabbits found it necessary to circle trees. Perhaps to throw off pursuers? At any rate, the tracks circled the pear tree and then the catalpa tree, where they doubled back and went toward the house, weaving in and out of the shrubs and the flower bed. It made me wonder if the rabbit had found some fermented corn. Then they went off along the side of the house. At the end of the house was a larger hole in the snow which indicated where the rabbit stopped as he surveyed the open crossing between the house and the garage. Then long bounding leaps to the garage where they became closer again until they circled the empty duck pen and went off across the field to burrow at the edge of the trees. Empty duck pen? Wait a minute, where are my ducks? Then I remembered they were in the pen in the garage as I already fed them. I double-checked the garage to make sure. They were not there. I spent all summer raising a small flock of big white ducks, and they were not in their pen. Somehow the gate was left open, and they were gone. Looking closer, I saw Mark's boot tracks going into the pen, and they stopped at the pipe going into the garage. It looked like he crawled through the pipe to the garage. I poked my head in and looked, but saw nothing except the light and hay where the pipe entered the garage. In the snow around me were duck tracks. As I started to trail them, thankful for my skill from following rabbits, I made a mental note to talk to my brother about this later. Following the trail, I was led past the garage, under the elderberry tree, across the now dead garden, and off into the woods behind the house. It was a good thing I had my snow boots with wool liners on because the snow was deep at the edge of the trees. I pushed through the waist-high drift and resumed tracking the ducks. The trail led back and forth, and at some point, the ground beneath me became water, which was covered with ice, which was covered with snow. I finally found them at the center of the swamp where some water pipes ran underground and kept the water there from freezing. Splashing happily in the open water of the swamp, my ducks ignored me when I called them. They didn't seem to think it was too cold for a swim, even though I would have argued with them if they could talk. I decided to circle around behind them and make a big noise to scare them off the water in the direction of the house. Then I could catch up and herd them back to their pen. It was a fine plan, and I supplemented it with a big stick. Coming around behind them, I swung the stick down hard at the edge of the ice and yelled. I'm not sure if this initial yell scared them, or if it was my yelp of surprise when the ice shattered beneath me and I fell through the ice, but I know my hollering as the cold water entered my boots helped. Thankfully, none of the water in the swamp was more than 8 to 10 inches deep. In my struggles to free myself, I discovered that not only was the water not frozen here, but the mud was also soft, and it would not let go of my boots. I struggled until finally, in desperation to get back to the house and warm up, I jerked as hard as I could. My bare foot came free of the boot. With one bare foot now in the water, I quickly lost interest in the other boot and jerked myself free to run as fast as I could the couple 100 yards to the house through the snow. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, running barely warm water on my feet and praying I would not have frostbite. I had seen pictures of frostbite in school and wanted no part of black toes. I heard the screen door slam and my grandfather came stomping into the house. He looked in on me and my red feet. Hey, Kevin, you should make sure and keep the duck pen closed or they could get out and get into the swamp where a coyote could get to them, he said, taking off his jacket. They were hanging around the open gate as if trying to make up their minds if they wanted out when I came up the hill, so I closed it for you. Thanks, Grandpa, I said through chattering teeth. Then, as if seeming to just notice that my lips were blue and my toes red, he smiled and reached down to feel one of my feet. It stung like fire when he grabbed it, but I was relieved when he said I did not have frostbite and adjusted the water temperature for me. After a few minutes, the feeling came back and I dried off and put on dry socks. I joined Grandpa in the kitchen where he was drinking coffee at the table. He pointed to a cup of hot chocolate he made for me. As I sat there drinking my hot chocolate, I recounted the tale to him. And he just laughed, but I could see in his eyes that mine was a tale that would eventually be told around the old potbelly stove over beers. I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.